All right.
On Jennifer Aniston neuron, there may be 10,000 or maybe even more neurons that respond relative.
Now, in that case, it was Jennifer Aniston, not a dude with a red shirt.
And there will be groups of neurons that very specifically respond to that when you think about those things. So you can do a lot of research on at that level. So this is a neuron. Here you have its sort of input region. This is called the dendrite in red. And then here at the cell body, there's a lot of electric machinery that we understand quite well. It generates this action with this pulse when it's sufficiently excited, and then it sends out that pulse onto the wire. This is the output wire. It's very complicated. And every time there's a connection, this is indicated in yellow, and that's a synapse. So synapse or synapse is a contact point between two neurons. And how much one neuron influences the next neuron is encoded in the strength of that synapse. And all the evidence shows that a memory, like the memory of my first kiss, or the memory that I know what Julius Caesar said when he was killed by his friend Brutus, all that sort of memory is encoded in the strength of billions of synapses that constitute memory, and that also ultimately give rise to consciousness, the feeling of something, right? What really gives rise to thought and consciousness and memory is the cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex is really a sheet. It's a pizza. It's pretty much, think of it a pizza that's 2 to 3 millimeters thick, pretty much like my vest here, 2 to 3 millimeter. It's this size, and we've got 2 of them, but they're highly folded. And this is a computational tissue that evolution invented roughly 200 million years ago. It's common to all mammals, and it gives rise to our identity, who we are, our feelings, our memory, our sense of self. And we at the Allen Institute, many other scientists are trying to understand what is the universal, what is the sort of the algorithm, what is the computation that's performed within this dense forest of 100 billion neurons, 100 billion trees that gives rise to all of this. So now what we're going to do, we're going to zoom in this last movie I'll show you. We're going to zoom in onto one piece of a sliver here that's incredible thin. It turns out, for those of you who know about numbers, 12 micrometer in thickness. That's maybe a tenth of the width of a human hair. So very thin. But we're going to zoom in great detail, because the more we look, the more details we see. I show this because the one thing that you're confronted with is overwhelming complexity. Each new generation of measurement techniques, of microscopes, reveals more and more complexity. It has to be complex because ultimately it has to give rise to the subtlety of the human mind. So what we'll see here is a piece of cortex from the mouse brain. Here again, it's one of those neurons, just like the one you showed before. You'll see a whole bunch of them, so we're going to take a trip with cool music that starts up here and that goes slowly down here. And it visualizes every single synapse. So what you're going to see are 3 colors. You'll see in high detail. You see magenta. Each magenta puncta, each point is a synapse. As I said, in this piece there's going to be a couple of billion synapses. Green is a subset of one particular kind of neuron, and the blue color you see is tubulin. It's dendrites and axons of other neurons. This is 1 millimeter again. So the millimeter is half the size of the width of a grain of rice. All right, and now so it's a mouse brain. The common laboratory mouse. The size of the brain is roughly a sugar cube. And that's where we'll zoom in. So just remember, the magenta are the synapses, and the green is one set of neurons. They have to be called layer 5 for the experts. And blue is tubulin that shows the wiring of axons. And now we'll go through this cortex.
Y'all, that's a rat brain. You know? Terry, you think about that three-dimensional printer, aren't you? That's what you're thinking about, I bet you, on that. Y'all help me with this. To do a neurological map of the brain of a rat, which is about how big? Sugar cube, would take 2 petabytes. What's a petabyte? P-E-T-A-B-Y-T-E. Y'all know? It's 1,000 terabytes. Let me tell you, this comes from National Geographic magazine, February 14 edition. You ought to read that. It's fascinating. And in that edition, they said to map a human brain like they are mapping this rat brain would take the equivalent of all the digital storage that currently exists on Earth. Try to wrap that up. One brain. So that business about how we don't use, 10% of our brain, all that kind of nonsense, it's incredible. It is complex. Principles here. Every activation, neurological activation, has its own pattern. Think of it like a spider web. When you have an experience and a memory is formed, then that, no matter how weak or strong that memory is, it has its own unique neurological web that is formed, okay? And it's kind of laid down, web on web, and all that complexity like you saw in the video with all the synapses and all that sort of thing. It's fascinating. Some of those become permanent immediately and fixed and almost inflexible and fairly easily recalled effortlessly. Others decay and are lost. What makes for immediate permanence? I want to know that as a teacher. All right? Let me ask you a question. Have you ever had food poisoning? How many had food poisoning? Do you know what you ate? Do you know where you ate it? How long ago was that? A long time ago. What did you have for lunch Thursdays a week ago?
Was there a Thursday last week?
You get the point, right? Some memories, some experiences are indelibly imprinted and forever non-forgettable, immediately, effortlessly. Others are not. What makes the difference? This is a quote from the book. Barclay says, when adults learn, they build on or modify networks that have been created through previous experience or learning. Okay? So when we learn anything new, we're building on what we've already experienced. I want to review something with you. This is sort of infantile. Don't be offended by this. Piaget's concepts. These concepts for Piaget. Piaget said a scheme was a mental category of representation. It's the way we interact with the world. When my oldest son was a little tyke, we bought him a Nerf basketball. And within a few hours, the 2 teeth he had in front had dislodged 2 sections of that Nerf basketball in a number of places, right? So because he had a scheme, and his scheme was, if I can hold it in my hand, I'm going to bite it. And he did that with bananas and anything he could hold in his hand until one day I gave him a golf ball. And when he bit down on that, what happened? Something happened up here. And according to Piaget, that's called disequilibrium. When new information that he tried to assimilate could not fit his existing scheme, he had to accommodate that scheme and change it. So now, instead of investigating his world through a biting round objects or biting things that I can hold scheme, he now has a new scheme that says, I now investigate my world by biting soft objects. Right? Has he learned? He's learned. Okay. When adults learn, again, referring to Barclay's comment, they build on or modify networks. That's an example of that with a child, not an adult. Children and adult doesn't make any difference, in my opinion, that have been created through previous experience or learning. So, can it be said, and I'm going to assert today, that there is no, I have never learned anything new without disequilibrium. without the mental unrest that comes when new information does not fit my existing framework. So I have to accommodate, change that framework in order to receive and take in and make that new information fit in some way. So how does this equilibrium occur? Can we as teachers make that happen? Do we really want our students to struggle? Actually struggle? Maybe. This memory model has existed since the early 80s, 90s. It's a kind of an information process, digital computer age model where you have three memory storages. Sensory memory, we have unlimited access to sensory stimulation coming in all the time. You have sensory stimulation coming in, most of it you're oblivious to. You know, you're not really thinking about the pressure of your butt in the seat there until I tell you, name it, and then you are. Or other stimuli, you probably haven't paid much attention to this fan motor, but it is there and it's there all the time and you're receiving that, but you're oblivious to most of it. So most of this stimuli that come into us is lost within 2 or 3 seconds due to what's time decay. Now decay, I think of a tree falling in the forest and taking 1,000 years to rot. No, I'm talking about 2 or 3 seconds. Unless we do something with it, we lose it. The moment we pay attention to it, we move it into short-term memory or working memory, conscious memory, right? And as long as we are conscious of it, thinking of it, working with it, then we have it in our working memory. The general rule about memory is the longer we have it in our attention span, in our attention space, the longer we work on it, keep it in active working memory, the more likely we are to store it permanently. So you have several things that can keep things in working memory. But the reason I chose this particular diagram was for this arrow right here. One of the ways that we move new information to long-term memory is through elaboration or elaborative rehearsal. And that's why, what color shirt did that dude have on?
Red.
Thank you very much. He looked like who?
George Clooney.
Oh, okay. So now, do you believe if I bring you back here a year from now and say that guy that Janet and Valerie were looking at, what color shirt? Do you think you'll remember a red shirt? I'll bet you will. I'll bet you will. The point is, the more thoroughly you catalog Slaughterhouse-Five, the easier it is to retrieve that. The more levels you process that information, cowboy boots, blue jeans, red shirt, hair, 6'3", a day's growth. The more thoroughly you process that information, elaborate on it, the more likely you are to put it in permanent storage in a way that you can retrieve it, right? Okay, what makes the difference in ease and difficulty of learning neurologically? Some images, ideas, concepts, experience are immediately and effortlessly stored permanently. And a couple of the things that make that happen are the element of surprise. When people are surprised, when you are surprised by something, then it's stored effortlessly and often permanently. The element of surprise. My classes have pretty well been predictable. How about yours? I mean, if a student's had me this semester, they know what they're going to get next semester, right? Are your courses that way pretty much? Pretty predictable? And are your courses, your class sessions from week to week, day to day, pretty predictable? Or do students ever get a surprise? Now, the dean gave us a surprise today, right? Y'all gonna remember that. We all will remember that because it took us by surprise, right? I didn't know what he was going to do. I wasn't sure when he went over to change shoes if he was going to dance, right? Or what? But then he got the whistle and I kind of cringed. I thought, well, but it was a surprise element. And so surprise also makes things store permanently, effortlessly. How often? I don't know. I don't know that we know. I don't know. Okay.
And this is done on a hollow podium at about 8:45 in the morning when these people are literally jerked awake.
Mm-hmm.
And I guarantee you that nobody gets that one on the next test when I say what is the first step in communication model? Stimulation.
Right.
But how often can you take that sort of physical and traumatic effect and use it without it getting diminished?
Probably as often as you could come up with novel approaches. With novel approaches. The second time you do it, it's no longer a surprise. Right. So a novel approach, a new approach. As often as you could do a novel approach that would genuinely be a surprise, probably would work. It's worth thinking about that. Emotional load is another thing that stores memory. Passion, interest, but emotional load. All of us can probably remember every bad thing that's ever happened to us, and we remember every good thing that happened to us. We can think of things that made us cry or made us angry, and if we ever get angry, if the emotion comes up, then we have all those memories that get cyclical, and we remember everything that's ever made us mad, right? If you're watching a movie and it makes you experience an emotion, then it makes you think about real life situations in which you experience the same emotion, right? So you're pulling up memories based on the emotional content. Those are stored in the amygdala and hippocampus area, and emotional memories have immediate, effortless storage and are very easily retrieved, as a matter of fact, unless there's some kind of psychological thing going on. But then most of our memories and most of what we do in the educational setting is not effortless, it is effortful. It demands a lot of effort, right? To learn, to remember, to recall, to engage new concepts. The general principle is, and I've already said this, the longer we hold a concept in working memory, the more likely it is to be moved to permanent storage. But we have this huge problem called what? Attention span. You know, we talk about attention span being 20 minutes or stuff like that. 30 seconds. About 30 seconds is really the capacity of working memory unless there is specific action taken to keep something in the attention focus. About 30 seconds. How many of you have already caught yourself, you've already been daydreaming since I've been talking? Yeah. Mike, it doesn't take long, does it? And we all have had that experience. It's natural. It's a natural occurrence. A teacher is teaching and they say something that makes us think of something else. And then we think of something else and think of something else, and then finally we're out there and the instructor, it's just dim in the background, right? It's dim in the background. And then have you ever done that and you thought, how did I get to thinking about that? And you try to reason your way back. Y'all ever done that? How did I get to thinking about that? And you wander back, and eventually your attention is regained in the classroom. But that's daydreaming. It happens naturally when ideas are prompted. So we have this attention span difficulty in maintaining focus long enough on something to enlarge the possibility that it's going to be stored permanently. In terms of cognitive strategies, Janet, what time is it? All right, we're going to quit here in just a second, just a minute or two. Levels of processing theory basically states and says that the more different levels we process something on, the more likely it is to be permanently stored and easily retrieved, i.e. the library accessibility. Levels of processing. In two ways in particular for our thought today. If the information or the material or the concept makes sense to me, does it make sense? A lot of times, if I were to go into you guys' class in engineering, you would be talking in a vocabulary and using information that really probably would not make sense to me. I would have to ask you to give me an application, give me an example of what you're talking about, right? Before some things could make sense to me. So in order for something to be processed at different levels, it has to have meaning to me. It has to make sense. This is why applications and illustrations are tremendously valuable in helping people connect with things they already know. Now, by the way, this goes under the heading of reconceptualization of previously learned information. One of the things that that researchers, cognitive psychologists have found out is that learning in some ways most readily occurs when we are able to take new concepts and reconceptualize them in terms of what we already know, okay? Of what we already know and experience. So if we can connect it to something that we already understand, already know, then we're way ahead of the game. That's why you have Algebra 2 after you have Algebra 1, right? Okay. Secondly, it's meaningful. It not only makes sense, but it has value. That's where the expectancy value issue, it has value to us. So it fits in with what we already know about how the world works, and it makes new material that is novel and previously unknown much more compatible with our existing neurological framework. So the key concepts that I've talked about here in terms of neuroscience and what works in the brain is that engagement and learning best occurs when there's a connection with things we already know, a connection with real life experience. We have a lot of criticism in higher education. Often we live in what? The ivory palace, and we don't do business in the swamp of everyday life. And so we get a lot of criticism sometimes, right, about what we're trying to teach and do being connected to the real world. The professional studies group certainly would not have that, probably have that criticism as much as we do on the education side over there. But connecting with what you already know, previously learned information. Secondly, is it meaningful? Is it meaningful to me? Do I understand the meaning? Do I understand the value? Do I understand how that does connect with other things? I'd go off on a tangent here from what we talked about in Dr. Hammett's a little bit, don't have time, but it seems to me, and this answers Terry, Terry's not here, why all those references maybe were from the 80s and 90s on that bibliography sheet. You know, in one sense, when we talk about things that we talked about today, we're arguing for a broad, wide, classic liberal arts education that teaches people how to think in any domain, as opposed to an education that only fits one domain. And we're in this struggle for pragmatism, right? Struggle of pragmatism in giving people the skills they need to operate in applied engineering, a very specific domain, as opposed to being thinkers in the broader sense of things. You understand what I'm saying there? It's a real difficult transition to make. Anyway, third is usefulness. How useful is this to me? How many students says, I'm going to check this box, what good is this going to do me? You know, I took that course, I never used that course in my life. Y'all ever had a course you never used in your life? You ever assigned a project to your class or an assignment that probably was going to be totally useless to them forever? Maybe. Another concept, the issue of novelty, uniqueness, newness, surprise, and so forth. Facilitates active learning. And then elaboration of what we previously know, expanding the neurological connections and networks. This is one of the reasons why cross-curricular education is very, very important, because it furthers that elaborative network. If you want to do leisure reading, I suggest look at Randy Jadd's articles going back to 1980 and all the way up to the current time about cognitive thinking. He has an article on surprise. This one it's a reading article, by the way, from the Chicago Institute of Reading there at Urbana-Champaign. And then I really encourage you to grab that National Geographic from February of 2014 and look at some of the pioneering work that's being done now in understanding brain and memory. All right? Stand up again. Janet will come, and we'll move on.
Thank you. A couple of people to help me pass this out.
Doodle, that's some serious doodle right there.
So what I wanted to do today is to pull out some of the, I don't need it, some of the student engagement strategies that were in the book and actually have us do it, which I think will actually be good after we've been sitting for a while. We'll talk and we'll work together and we'll kind of explore a few of these things. So if you have a QR code reader, I gave you a QR code and you can pull it up on your iPad or any other digital device you have. And if you don't have a QR code reader, I have the site up here and you can find it later because I believe they're going to post it on the college website. So I just put a few things on this Google site. For example, I added, to get us started, the actual purpose of why we're doing this. Everyone engaged, everyone successful. So in the beginning of this academic year, Dean Hammett gave us 3 ways to look at engagement in our college. So an engaged faculty member is one who is fully absorbed and enthusiastic about engaging students in their own academic content. So that's the first way, and that relates directly to all of us in this room. The second type of engagement is an engaged student. We've talked a lot today about students that aren't engaged and students that are engaged. But what does that really mean? Fully absorbed and enthusiastic about academic pursuits and takes positive action to further their content knowledge. So they're engaged in the learning and not just to get a grade. You know, when children come up through school, P12, they're very grade focused. That's why they're there, they think, to earn the grade. When they come to college, we want them to do something different. We want them to engage in their content, to prepare for their career. The last way to look at engagement is a staff member. Our college is full of staff members, whether it's secretaries or others that help us out, support personnel. We want them to also be engaged in what we're doing. That's very important because it takes a lot of us to get this mission done. So engagement really is on 3 levels. Even though most of us in here are professors, we want to consider the points of view and the ways that others are engaged. So just for a second, turn to the person next to you and talk about these different types of engagement and where you fall in that paradigm. So turn and talk. Yep. Yep. That's a great point, Butch. That's a great point. Good.
And I have been a student here, so I'm used in my classes.
So go ahead and bring your conversations to a close. We could talk about this for a long time, but I know, aren't you ready to get out because it's Friday afternoon? So bring your conversations to a close, but just very quickly, comments on that? Comments on that? Where do you fall? We're just getting started. It's good to talk about
We
things.
had to break the ice before we could
That's very important to break the ice. Comments on this? I heard a good one up here from Butch, but share what you and Priscilla were talking about.
Just that I think on some level, at least for me personally, I follow these questions. Obviously, I'm technically academic, but you know, something like when I tried to help out with the robotics fair and stuff over at Keon, I was just a staff, I was just a guy trying to help out.
Exactly. Part of the team.
And obviously, if they like to pay their students,
That
I mean, I think on some level, we follow these categories.
I agree. Do you agree with that? I think that's a great insight into that. On some level, we fall at different points into each of those categories. We could be a student when we're learning something. We could be a staff member when we're helping out with something, or when we're engaging with students that are maybe in other majors or other disciplines other than our own. And it takes a village. It takes all of us to be actually engaged so that everyone can move forward in their learning and in their goals that they want to meet. So how do we do that? What do we do in the classroom to make engagement more viable? Well, one thing that we can go back to is this good old standard of Bloom's taxonomy. How many of you remember Bloom's taxonomy? Oh, Okay, everything that we do in education pretty much is built upon Bloom's taxonomy. You know, Bloom's originally was categorized by nouns. In, I think it was 2001, it was recategorized with verbs. Why? Because learning should be active. It requires an action. So on Bloom's taxonomy, we have remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. We call these down here the lots or the lower order thinking skills. The HOTS fall up here, higher order thinking skills. All are applicable for different things. Someone earlier, and I was facing this way, so I can't remember who it was, but it was someone back here, was saying that there's sometimes that you have to lecture. You have to. Was that you, Patrick? Might have been. Sometimes you have to lecture. I'm giving you a little mini lecture right now, but I'm not going to do this the whole time because I want to move out of this lower order idea into something higher where I'm going to ask you to actually apply what you've learned and to be able to do something with it. So when you're planning coursework, when you're planning instruction or a learning episode, you want to make sure that you have a little bit of all of those areas. You don't want to stay just stuck in the lower order thinking skills, or what I call teaching on the floor. If you teach only with lower order thinking skills, you're teaching on the floor. You're never raising students up to the higher levels where they could be. So you want to make sure that you are doing that. If you look in our book, which everybody has their book with them, correct? Flip to the back to chapter 12. If you don't have it, pair up with someone that has it. I see you back there. If you don't, do you guys have a book at all back there? Can I bring you mine? We can share.
We memorized ours.
Yeah, oh, so you're all good?
Yours have all the answers.
It might. So if you go to chapter 12,
Oh, that was good.
yeah. Chapter 12 is knowledge, recalling, understanding. So this chapter talks about these lower order thinking skills. And there's some strategies in there that you can use. They're called in the book student engagement strategies or sets. Now, chapters 12, 13, 14, and on are just lists of strategies, and that's what my part is today, and that's why I told you that we're going to do some different things. But if you flip on through, just flip through. You guys don't have one at all to look at? You're trying to share? Okay. Okay, here. Let me let you have this. Could you pass that down? You guys don't have one either? Just. So chapter 12, remembering knowledge. Chapter 13, I don't have my book in my hand. Is it